Okay, welcome to Research Methods. In this lesson, I'm going to talk to you about general purposes of research. But before I go into the lesson, I want to introduce you to the class and what you can expect from the class. You will be taken on a journey where you will learn the various types of research and when they're appropriately used and some considerations when doing research and so forth. For example, you'll learn about observational research and survey research, and you'll learn about correlational research, experimental research, developmental research, quasi-experimental research, and so forth. There are so many different research designs. By the end of this class, you will have a basic understanding of all the various research types, as well as when you use them, and some considerations for the strengths and weaknesses of each research strategy. But let me go into our lecture. Now, our lecture, again, this is our first lecture. Now, disregard the coding because the coding for research methods is different for each university. So at St. Francis College, this is really 1101 Lecture 1. So let's go in and talk about how we're going to approach this. Each lesson will have a series of learning objectives. These learning objectives will be on the slideshow, so you have a roadmap for what I expect you to have learned by the end of the lesson. So while before putting the slideshow up, I talked to you about, in general, what you're going to get for the whole semester, now it's more focused on what I want you to get out of this particular lesson. So in chapter 1, I'm hoping that you will learn the various reasons for doing research and why it's important to understand research methods. I will also give you a distinction between scientific methods versus pseudoscientific methods. We'll talk about the 4 goals of scientific research, and we'll make a distinction between basic and applied research. So in general, scientific research provides us with a means for answering practical questions. So here are just 2 examples of some questions that scientific research could address. What causes aggression or violence? Well, what you will discover, whether it be through a literature search, a literature review, or your own study, is that it very rarely is it one thing that drives a given outcome. There are many factors that could result in aggression or violence. For example, a person could have modeling in the home, right? So if a person observes aggression, they're going to be more likely to engage in aggression themselves, either as children, adolescents, or adults. And there was a famous study that reflected this, the Bobodel study with Bandura. In addition, there are other factors that could drive aggression, things like frustration, right? There's a frustration aggression hypothesis. So if a person is in a very crowded room and it's very hot, that frustration that emerges could result in an increased likelihood of being aggressive. An interesting finding related to temperature and frustration aggression is that if you follow baseball, the hotter the stadium, the more likely a batter is going to be hit by pitch. So as it gets hotter, it could result in frustration in the pitcher, which they could plunk a batter. We also have genetic and hormonal and endocrine factors that play a role in aggression. So things like testosterone is linked to aggression. So what causes aggression or violence? There are many things that cause it, but through scientific studies, we can demonstrate any one of these factors plays a role. Another question that could be answered by scientific research is, how does stress affect our health and relationships? Well, the first thing I will tell you is that right now we're speaking in very broad terms, but in lecture 4, we're going to discuss the concept of an operational definition. And an operational definition is a clear understanding of how you measure or manipulate a variable. How are we defining stress? How are we defining health? What kind of relationships are we talking about, right? But let's just take it at face value for this particular lesson. And we know that stress could affect your heart functioning, so it increases the risk of heart attack and heart failure. We know it affects blood pressure. We know it affects the behavioral outcomes of people. People who are stressed tend to either close down or lash out sometimes. So there are many different ways it could affect our health and relationships. And I'm sure you might have thought of other answers to these questions, but it's through science and scientific research that we get to those answers that might be popping into your head. Now, I said to you that there are 4 major uses of research methods. The first purpose or use of research methods is to allow you to critically examine the claims made in mass media, such as newspapers, magazines, internet. And what you will discover is that many times the claims that you read in a newspaper are either biased or inaccurate. If you have a good understanding of research, if they cite a study and misrepresent it, you could go back to the article and be able to determine where they went wrong. So it allows us to critically examine claims that are made. And there are many examples of when people make outrageous claims. So if you're watching the television late at night, it's not uncommon for them to have infomercials on where they try and sell a product. So let's say weight loss. This pill will help you lose 20 pounds in 1 month. And then they'll show you a person who, I lost 83 pounds. And we should be happy that that person lost 83 pounds. But you oftentimes see an asterisk by that number of how much they lost. And in the fine print at the bottom, it says results not typical if it's a magazine. Or it might say at the bottom of the television screen, this was done in conjunction with diet and exercise. Well, at that point, we don't know if it was really the pill that caused the weight loss or it was the diet and exercise, because diet and exercise alone very well could result in weight loss. So we have to be very careful about how we consume information. And one benefit of knowing research methods is that you can become more of a skeptic. And a healthy skepticism is a good thing. If a claim sounds too good to be true, then maybe it's too good to be true. And it's your job to really think about what's being said to you as a consumer of information and challenge it as needed. So that's the first use of research methods. A second use of research methods is within many of the professions. So if you are a mental health professional, or if you're a business professional, or if you're an educator, your work is guided or informed by research. I am a clinical psychologist by training. So I had to go through a whole series of schooling before I got my doctorate and my license. But what we do in this schooling is they teach us how to do clinical interviewing. They teach us how to do psychological assessment. They teach us how to provide individual, couples, family, and group therapy. They teach us all of this. But how do we know what works and what doesn't work? Our treatment approach is based oftentimes on a phrase called evidence-based practice. And evidence-based practice is just a fancy way of saying the therapeutic intervention we're doing is based on science. So the kind of treatments we use, the testing procedures, everything we do as psychologists is governed by science. And if there's a treatment approach that is not effective or science does not support it, eventually that treatment approach will be removed. Now, I'm going to give you an example of a treatment approach that was used pre-scientific psychology. If you go to the times of Benjamin Rush, which is one of the first American psychiatrists, Benjamin Rush used various approaches to affecting blood flow. And he believed that blood flow affects mental health. So he would put you in a spinning chair. He'd spin you around and around and around. And that was viewed as a therapeutic intervention. Before Benjamin Rush, there was bloodletting. Now, you don't go to your psychologist and engage in bloodletting today, do you? Or your psychologist isn't going to spin you around in a chair and have blood rush to your head and say, well, that's treatment. Why is it that bloodletting and the spinning approach that I talked to you about is no longer included in our discipline? Science. Science has demonstrated that they're ineffective, and only effective treatment should be used. Otherwise, you're wasting people's time, money, and messing with their psyche. A second industry that relies on science is the business industry. If you are trying to determine how to increase workplace morale or how to select an employee, this is oftentimes governed by science. So there are market researchers who spend time trying to explore how to do this. Now, you may, some of you, if you're working, you may notice that you get a break. What if I told you 100 years ago, you might have worked 8, 9, 10 hours straight without a break? Well, why is it that you get a 30-minute break? Well, what was found through research is that it increases productivity. And that kind of seems counterintuitive, right? So if you're working continuously, surely you would get more done. The answer is no, you won't. You're going to burn out. So giving people a break is useful. You might also be at a company that has Employee of the Month. What's the purpose of Employee of the Month? The purpose of Employee of the Month is to incentivize you to work as hard as possible. Now, researchers have found that Employee of the Month increases morale. You might have a coffee pot or a water cooler. Like, these little things make a big difference in workplace morale. And all of this is governed by science. Through scientific research, we've demonstrated that these are effective in increasing productivity. There's another side of the business industry, which is designed at getting you to buy things. So if you were an industrial and organizational psychologist, You might be interested in that side of things. So things like imperatives. People are more likely to buy things when you tell them to do it. For example, I would ask you, what is Coca-Cola's slogan? Drink Coke. Now, they are telling you to drink Coke, and what do? You say, okay, I'm going to drink Coke, right? So you're more likely to buy Coca-Cola because of their slogan. Similarly, Nike. Nike has a slogan, just do it. Just do it. Do what? We don't even know what they're telling you to just do. Just do it. But that slogan increases the likelihood of you buying Nike sneakers. So imperatives, rebates, coupons, things like that, whether it be a mail-in rebate or an instant rebate, if you have to fill out a form, they make you more connected to a product, making you more likely to buy that product in the future. And there are so many other examples. So the business industry is governed by science. And there are market researchers, there's employment researchers and so forth. And in education. So if you have individuals with special needs, how do you work with a special need population? Well, research will tell you, depending on what the challenge is, how to best meet the needs of the students. So you get the idea, though. So various professions require research to guide what they do. A third use of research methods is legislation and policy making. So research is responsible in guiding policy. So if you are trying to decide whether or not to include a bike path in a park, and you are a part of city council, you might survey your members of your community, your constituents, right? So you might survey your constituents to see what their attitudes are before you make that proposal, before you push that policy. So many laws are governed or established because of research or the implications of research. Now, we also know in forensic psychology, based on research, about testimony and the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. So if you were a juror, you might be influenced by a statement of a person who is an eyewitness. What if I told you that many eyewitness testimonies are either incomplete, inaccurate, exaggerated, or even fabricated? Well, there's classic research by Elizabeth Loftus, who talks about the misinformation effect and how we can embed false memories into people who are eyewitnesses, and they could report out bad information. And eyewitness testimony is powerful because that's used by prosecutors to put people in jail. And we know that there are many people who are in a jail cell that is based on eyewitness testimony, and it was flawed. So let's say there's about 4% of people who do not belong in jail based on they were wrongfully convicted based on eyewitness testimony. That's 1 out of every 25 people in jail don't belong there, to put into perspective. So research can help you in understanding the impact of eyewitness testimony and weighting eyewitness testimony appropriately rather than going too far with it. And our fourth and final use of research methods in this chapter is it's used to measure the effectiveness of an intervention. So if you were trying to help out and in an impoverished community or with children with special needs, the question might be, does early intervention or Head Start increase the IQ of children in impoverished areas? Does it help? Well, you could do research to determine that. Now, why would you want to do research to determine the effectiveness of an intervention? Because billions of dollars per year are spent on things like early intervention and Head Start. Spoiler alert, they do work, they do help. So early intervention and Head Start are very good programs. Does DARE decrease the risk of abusing drugs? Now, I don't know if you had DARE when you were in school, but DARE stands for Drug Abuse Resistance Education. And in the 3rd grade, I had DARE, and members of the local police department would come in and talk about the impact of using drugs and how to avoid peer pressure and all these things. So the question is, does DARE decrease the risk of abusing drugs? The answer is yes, it reduces the risk. Now, when we look at program evaluation or effectiveness of an intervention, you might ask a series of questions. One is it effective? And a second question is it worth the money we're spending on it? So the efficiency of a program is also evaluated. So one of the criticisms of DARE is that it does reduce the risk of abusing drugs, but not enough to make it worth the money that's spent on it by the municipalities. How about sex education? Teaching people about healthy sex practices. Does it reduce the risk of developing a sexually transmitted disease? The answer is yes, of course. But one thing that we found through research is that this education should occur before a person is already engaging in sexual activities, right? Because you have to capture the attention before a person's engaging in the behavior, because the person may have already engaged in risky behavior before the education. So you might see a letter in the 5th grade or 8th grade or 10th grade. Sometimes it's multiple times where a person is sent a letter sent home to the parents or guardians saying, would you allow your child to be part of this workshop on sex education? And parents opt out, but it's probably not a good thing to opt out. It's probably a good thing for your kids to learn about it before they're engaging in risky sexual behavior. All right. So those are the 4 uses of research based on your book. Now, Charles Sanders Peirce talked about the various ways a person can analyze behavior and form beliefs. And he talked about concepts like intuition, authority, tenacity, the concept of the a priori method, and a scientific method. This semester, our focus will be on the scientific method, because it's the only method, as you will see, that encourages you to be skeptical and question what your beliefs are. So let's go through some of these approaches. So when we talk about intuition, intuition could take on many forms. It could be explaining your own behavior, or it could be explaining the behaviors of others, or intuition could be used to explain events that you observe. But the problem with intuition is you accept unquestionably your personal judgment. So you follow your gut. You may have heard that saying, follow your gut. And the problem with following your gut is that sometimes intuition is wrong. And it's actually wrong more than you would imagine. But what happens is you remember the times your intuition was correct, and you ignore the times your intuition was wrong. So when you accept your personal judgment without question, that is a problem, because there are oftentimes different ways to see an event or explain the behaviors of other people. And we know that personal biases can affect our perceptions, and our biases can lead to incorrect conclusions about cause and effect. So be careful with intuition. And here's it could be a cognitive bias, it could be an emotional bias, but biases affect our judgments. And there's a good one when it comes to the concept of illusory correlation. An illusory correlation, the root of illusory is illusion. You find a pattern in random events. You link things together that shouldn't be. So you may have heard the concept, if people are gamblers, that this is a hot table or a cold table. The reality is there is no such thing as a hot table or a cold table. It's an illusion. Because if you string out enough events together, then you will see it's a wash. There is no such thing as a hot table or a cold table. And casinos rely on your belief that a streak is either going to continue if you're doing well, or if you're not doing well, it's bound to turn around. And both of these beliefs are just not correct. And the reasons why casinos have the upper hand is people rely on, hey, I'm up 500. Ooh, now I'm up 1,000. Ooh, let me continue. You play long enough, you're going to lose your money. It's an illusion that the streak is going to continue. Or I'm down $500. I'm down $1,000. It's got to turn around. It's got to go back. Well, not necessarily. You may run out of money before it turns around. So this idea of looking for patterns in random events or streaks is based on an illusion. We put things together. So moral of this story is avoid intuition, because your gut can drive you to make decisions that actually don't belong together. So when we talk about intuition, you are following your gut, following your perception without question. Another source of information, according to Charles Peirce, is authority. Now, authority is when you follow the word of another person on blind faith. Now, there are many different authority figures. Parents are authority figures. Religious leaders are authority figures. The media is considered an authority. Government officials are considered authority figures. And professors, even we are considered authority figures. And you might take what we have to say without question. And that's a mistake, because even authority figures get it wrong sometimes. Your parents are not always correct. Religious leaders don't always get it right. The media, especially with the pace of the media today, to be the first one to break a story, has to do more retractions than you could imagine. Government officials, I think if today's political climate isn't indicative of this, but government officials don't always get it right. And professors, as well-intentioned as we are not infallible. 99 of 100 times, we're going to be correct, right? We studied, we went through schooling, so we're competent in the area that we're teaching on. But sometimes professors make mistakes. Now, you might ask yourself, well, why is it that we take an authority figure's word on blind faith without question? Well, the answer is that we oftentimes lack the resources to investigate the claims. So we rely on what we perceive as more knowledgeable members of society to give us the information. We don't have the time or resources to investigate ourselves. But I'm going to encourage you to question authority. I'm going to encourage you to challenge your parents. Ask pointed questions to religious leaders. Take that which the media says with a grain of salt. Question the motives of government officials. And yes, challenge us as professors. There's nothing wrong with engaging in debate with your professor. There's nothing wrong with asking a question or disagreeing with the philosophies of your professors. That's okay. And now that you know that people form beliefs and make decisions based on authority, and now that you know that authority figures don't always get it right, I'm going to encourage you to challenge us. So, what are some factors that influence the authority of an individual? Well, this is a question that was asked for thousands of years. So if we go back to the work of Aristotle, an ancient Greek philosopher, he was interested in the factors that influence persuasion and attitude change. And he wrote in the book Rhetoric, when people are viewed as more credible, as having more authority. Well, if the person was viewed as prestigious, as in the case of a person with a major title, such as a professor, or if they're viewed as trustworthy, as in the case of parents, or respectable, as in the case of clergy, you are going to believe that person more. And if you had all three of these components, then you're more likely to be persuaded by that individual because of their credentials. So it's interesting that even in ancient Greek philosophy, we talked about what drives your decision making. Now, here's the limitations to authority. One major problem with accepting an authority figure's word is what they're saying may be wrong. It might be incorrect. Parents are not always correct. Teachers are not always correct. No one is always correct. And because we can get it wrong, it's upon you to challenge authority. And as we will see, the scientific approach rejects the notion of accepting information of authorities on blind faith. It is okay to be skeptical. And I will talk to you about the difference between being cynical and skeptical when we get to that point in a lecture. But it is okay to be skeptical. And scientific skepticism is a good thing. And we need to have more information before we draw meaningful conclusions. So if you don't have enough information, don't jump to a decision. A third source of information and decision making is the method of tenacity. The method of tenacity is to be stuck in your beliefs. So being fixed in your position, regardless of the counter arguments. So if I were to go and debate a member of the KKK, so a person who believes in negative stereotypes about ethnic groups, negative religious stereotypes, bigotry, right? And I were to talk to a member of the KKK about the research behind what they're saying and why it's wrong, we might talk for an hour or two, and it may not change a damn thing. So they might say, oh, I don't know, whites are better than ethnic minorities, or more intelligent than ethnic minorities. And then you start pulling out the research of nature and nurture and how they go hand in hand on IQ. It won't make a difference. They're going to stick to their belief regardless of the counter evidence. Another example, when we look at cross-cultural work, is when you have people who emigrated. When people migrate to the United States, you'll see a difference in the worldview of first generation, second generation, third generation individuals. More often than not, first generation immigrants are going to romanticize their country of origin. And they're going to adhere very strongly to the culture of their country of origin. The second generation is going to oftentimes blend the cultures of the two. And by the third generation, there's oftentimes an assimilation. And it's not uncommon for there to be intergenerational conflict. It's not uncommon for the grandparents to fight with the grandchildren, or the parents to fight with their children about cultural beliefs. So let's take an example of medicine. If you come from certain communities, you might be skeptical of Western medicine. And you might say, Western medicine is bogus. And then you might have a child who is more integrating of Western values, and they might adhere to Western medicine more. You might debate one another for an hour or two, and in the end, nothing changes, because the person is stuck in their belief. So the grandparent or the parent might still adhere to their beliefs regardless of anything you have to say, and vice versa. So the method of tenacity is that we accept our belief unquestionably and reject any counter evidence. The problem with the method of tenacity is that it's not rational, and it certainly isn't scientific. So if you are set in your belief and nothing a person can say or do can change your belief, then that's not science, because science is constantly questioning itself, challenging an outcome. And it never stops. It's a self-refining system that goes on and on and on. So whenever you get stuck in a belief and you don't want to question it, that's a problem. A priori. Now, the a priori method, the root, if you see this word, is prior. So a priori method is a belief that is pre-existent before any study or examination. More oftentimes, the a priori method is based on what society believes as a whole, that you seem to accept. And it's oftentimes viewed as an extension of an authority, but the authority now is the general society as opposed to an individual person. Now, what do these four sources of information and decision making have in common? They lack skepticism. They lack questioning. Well, when we talk about science and the scientific method, our decisions are based on experience. Science is governed by empiricism, empirical evidence. So what our knowledge and decision making is based on observation. So the good thing about science over intuition, over authority, over tenacity, over the a priori method is that science is self-correcting. And I told you earlier in this lesson that people once believed in bloodletting as a source of treating mental illness. We don't believe that anymore. And the reason why we don't believe that anymore is because through science, we have found no significant difference between those who received bloodletting versus those who didn't. So now we use talk therapy to help you reorganize your thoughts and emotions. That's therapy, right? And in the event that what we do now is deemed to be not as effective, it will change in the future. So if we look to the past, we will see that what we believe today is very different than even 50 years ago. And what I'm gonna say, and hopefully it makes you feel uncomfortable, is if we look to the future 50 years, there are some things you're being taught today that are gonna fall out of favor, that are not going to pass scientific muster, and they will be rejected as well. So it's possible that things that you're learning today will change in the future based on new information. And that is a healthy process. So you're always making decisions based on the best information you have at that time, and you're always questioning. And I keep emphasizing skepticism, skepticism, skepticism. Skepticism is viewed negatively oftentimes, but that's not really what skepticism is. Skepticism is the ability to question. What people are mixing up is the difference between skepticism and cynicism. A cynic is going to be negative or pessimistic about things. That's what it means to be cynical or cynicism. Skepticism, you're in neutral. You're not negative or positive. You're uncertain. You're questioning. So scientific skepticism is a good thing. So who are we skeptical about? When we talk about scientific skepticism, whose work do we question? Scientists question everyone's work, even their own. For example, many of you are familiar with the work of Pavlov and classical conditioning. When Pavlov was doing his work, he was not interested in classical conditioning. He was interested in the vagus nerve and this salivation reflex. He expected when food hits the tongue that you would start to salivate to help aid in digestion. What he found was with the dogs, they started to salivate even before food hit the tongue. And you know what he said? That's not right. That's not what it should be. He questioned his own outcomes. So he developed a carefully designed study where he ignored all the cues, auditory, visual, and so forth. And he found the same outcome. He replicated it. And he said, I was expecting salivation to occur only as an unconditioned reflex. Well, guess what? People can learn to salivate too. So many scientific discoveries happened by accident through careful observation. So when they looked and said, hey, that's not right, that's not what I expected, they say, well, what happened? But what's beautiful about me describing this is that scientists question their own outcomes too. We don't even accept our own beliefs at face value. So that's scientific skepticism. And at the heart of the self-refining system of science is empiricism, skepticism, and so forth. So we are relying directly on observation. Now let's shift gears a little bit. So Goodstein talks about the evolution of science, right? So Goodstein's evolved theory of science. He says, in order for science to evolve, there are 4 things that must occur. The first, and I'm going to go through all 4 of these on the next couple slides. The first is that observations must be accurately reported to others. Next, you have to verify the ideas. You have to find information that supports that. Then you have to be open to counter arguments or difference of opinion. And then you have to have neutral outside parties review your research to identify potential flaws. So let's go through it. First thing we said about the evolved theory of science is that you have to accurately report your information to others. Now, it's very important how you report your findings and how you did your methodology, because that's going to impact other people's ability to replicate your findings. Because if I found a unique finding, maybe it was a fluke. Maybe it was how I did it or who I am, some kind of charisma, whatever it might be. Accurately reporting your methodology and your results allows for other people to reproduce your study. And if they reproduce it, then you get greater confidence in the outcome. One big no-no in science is we don't make up our results. Fabricating data is unethical and it comes with strong sanctions. What do I mean by that? You could lose your position in academia if you misrepresent your findings. And I'm going to give you an example of that. How many of you have heard that the MMR shot is linked to autism, right? So you may have heard that. What if I told you that that is just not true? There was a study done by Dr. Wakefield in which he made up the results. And once this study became popularized, the horse was out of the gate. The only problem is that his research assistants stated later that he made up all the findings. What happened to Dr. Wakefield? Well, he lost his license, can't practice medicine anymore. He has lost his credibility. But what happened to the general public? The general public was misled. And there are people who oppose vaccination based on his work. And the problem is that other studies have been conducted. And when I say other studies, I'm talking about thousands of studies have been conducted to demonstrate that there's no meaningful link between the MMR shot and autism. So, how you vaccinate, the vaccinations themselves, there's no link between that and autism. So, accurately report your findings. So, step 1. Step 2 is that we search for discovery and verification of our ideas. It's not uncommon that we're doing research in our lab separately from another person doing research in their lab, and we might be looking at the same thing through a different lens or using different terminology. Well, by searching for other people who might have found similar things, it strengthens our argument, right? It increases our confidence in the outcome. But as I said to you, the scientific method requires you to question. So if we didn't do phase 3, then we would be no different than all of the pre-scientific methods we talked about. So in order to have an evolution of science, you have to have an open exchange or competition of ideas. You have to be willing to find the arguments of those who disagree with you, those whose research doesn't support what you found, and give them equal opportunity to present their work. And there are many aspects of psychological science where we don't have the final verdict. For example, if we were to talk about the concept of microaggressions, I have written several papers talking about the impact of microaggressions on the recipient of microaggressions. I believe microaggressions are a real concept. But that doesn't mean that everybody agrees with me. There are other scientists who challenge this notion. For example, the late Scott Lilienfeld. Lilienfeld challenged the work by Durald Wing Su and suggested that the concept of microaggressions is oftentimes a very open concept. It's not well defined, and it's very subjective. And because of that, it's not met the standards of science. Now, there are responses to that. If you want to look, in 2017, there was a whole bunch of articles that came out with the Association of Psychological Science. Their journals had a whole section on this. It goes back and forth. Now, I do believe that disagreement is a healthy disagreement. Another area where science is kind of not sure where to land is on the impact of religiosity and spirituality. So when you do research on religion and spirituality, many researchers have argued that religion and spirituality increases health promotion, increases social outcomes. There are critics of this argument that says, well, maybe it's not the religion itself or the spirituality itself, it's the community factors. And there's a third group of people that says, yeah, but the religion comes with community. So there's debate, and the jury is still out. So this is healthy. Having dissent, disagreement is okay. It's healthy. And notice how I'm not saying I do land on one side of both of these arguments based on research that I've been part of. But that doesn't mean that I believe I'm the final truth, because I know there's a counter argument. I invite an open exchange of ideas. And eventually there will be enough evidence to answer this question one way or another. But science also requires you to have your ideas refuted. So good science requires falsifiability, the ability that your theory can be rejected or refuted. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with being incorrect. And I'm going to give you an example. Franz Gall believed in the concept of phrenology. He said that the bumps on your skull affect various mental states or psychological abilities. And he had a whole map on the different parts of the head and what they did. Turns out every single one of his labels were wrong. Turns out that the bumps on your head doesn't even match your skull and doesn't even match your brain. But Franz Gall is in our history books. You can't take the history of psychology or intro psychology without hearing the name Franz Gall. So you can be wrong and still make it into psychological textbooks. So what did Franz Gall give us, though? He was wrong about everything he said about the location and phrenology, but neuroscientists found value in something he said. And that was the different parts of the brain do different things, or localization in the brain. So even though his theory was proven to be false, the concept inspired further research. And good research can come out of faulty ideas too. So, as a future budding scientist, don't be afraid to be wrong. Being wrong is okay. And that's the beauty of science, is because it's unemotional. Be emotionally detached to your outcomes. Last but not least on this evolution of science journey is peer review. Peer review, if you're going to publish a journal, publish an article, you have to engage in peer review. That is, a series of experts in the field will review your work to determine whether or not it's sufficiently representative of what you found. And it's not uncommon during the peer review process that your work gets rejected and requires revisions before it's entertained. The most recent publication that I have about to come out was required to be submitted 3 times. 3 times before it was accepted by the journal. There was nothing in terms of the methodology that was flawed. It was that they felt that certain areas needed to be built up more, certain areas needed to be contracted more. There were some grammatical or typographical errors, and they will give you feedback both on a macro and micro level. So peer review also serves as a gatekeeper for scientific research to make sure that that which goes out to the public is an accurate representation. Now, I do encourage people to be careful if they're ever, later in their career, they're a reviewer for a journal. Don't let your personal biases impact your review. That does happen from time to time. You might submit an article to a journal and your findings are contradictory to a reviewer's beliefs. And they might oppose publication based on that alone. Now, they really shouldn't do that, because we already said you should engage and celebrate a competition of ideas. But when people become emotionally attached rather than detached, this can happen. And you'll see it in their review. They'll offer you constructive feedback, or they'll say, hey, have you seen the work of so-and-so, which is different. So, but that's all a healthy process. Eventually it'll get published if it's appropriate. So peer review allows you to check for flaws before it goes out there. Now, Karl Popper is another major player that I want you to know about. He talks about the phases of how we should be thinking. So the first thing we should do in science is identify a problem. So you see a problem, then you offer solutions to the problem, and then you find problems with your solution. You go round and round over and over and over until you process the whole thing. So that's Karl Popper. He says a problem, conjecture, refutation, right? Now, similar to what we said before, Karl Popper suggests that there should be a principle of falsifiability. That is to say, you should make a statement about what you think should happen and run the risk of being incorrect. That's okay. So you will notice that we start out with hypothesis testing. And hypothesis testing, we make predictions. These risky predictions, we make them before we collect the data, because it's a lot easier to say, I think XYZ is going to happen after you collect the data. That's called post-diction. That's bad science. And some of the early work of psychoanalysts like Freud and Adler, they formulated theories without collecting the data, or they took what they saw to try and fit into a theory rather than making, I believe X will happen, and doing an empirical study. So whatever theories are good, they will stay. Whatever theories that aren't supported by research will eventually fall to the wayside. Now, so far I've emphasized scientific methods, be a scientist, be skeptical. And it's clear that the advantage of the scientific method over the other method is that it's objective, it's unemotional in the way it collects data, evaluates data, and reports data. However, that doesn't mean the other things we talked about are bad. Intuition, as we will also hear about next lesson, is a great source of information, a great source of research. But you have to do the research to figure out if your gut was true. Authority figures is a great source of information, but you can question them, right? So we can integrate some of the pre-scientific methods as much as possible. Now, it's true that sometimes science hasn't weighed in. Then if you want to rely on other things like intuition, that's fine. Just remain skeptical and be eyes wide open. Now, there are people, pseudoscientists, who try and latch themselves to scientists, even though they're not actually scientific in nature. So there are people who, similar to the infomercials we talked about, who will make scientific claims without using real science. And one of my favorite shows to watch is called Shark Tank. And Shark Tank is a very fascinating show to watch because one of the sharks is Mark Cuban. And one thing that Mark Cuban goes in on is with these health pitches. So a person might pitch their tea to help with digestion or whatever. And oftentimes these medicines, the person pitching it will make claims that are just unsubstantiated. And they'll use fancy scientific words to wow you, but they overstate their claim without evidence. And what Mark Cuban does is he rips them to shreds, asking them, how did you make that claim? What studies have you done? And then as they start to talk about the studies, he pokes holes in it. Now, pseudoscientists come in all kinds of forms. So I talked to you about Shark Tank and people marketing a business, but it could be astrologers and so forth. But be careful and be critical of the information that comes in, because pseudoscientists are out there who will try and get you to buy things. Our brand is the #1 brand on the market. Who said? How do you know? And on the internet, there are a whole bunch of these weight loss supplements, health supplements, all kinds of things. Be careful. Now, one strategy that pseudoscientists use, as I think I alluded to, is that they'll latch themselves on to a reputable organization. So they'll latch themselves to the American Psychological Association or whatever and say, look, I'm endorsed by so-and-so. And they'll use that linkage to a reputable organization to gain credibility. Be careful with that. So how do you know something is pseudoscience? Well, the hypotheses are rarely tested, the methodology is not reported, or the validity of the data is questionable. They use anecdotes rather than scientific evidence. They ignore counter evidence. Things are very vague, and the claims are rarely revised. So those are just a few examples of pseudoscience. Be careful. Now, I said there are 4 goals of science. 4 goals of science are to describe behavior, predict behavior, determine cause and effect, and explain behavior. And we're going to go through each of these 4, and we're going to link them to different research methods or strategies that we'll talk about later in the semester. The first goal of science is to describe behavior. And if your goal is to describe behavior, all you need to do is careful observation and report out what you see. And there are methodologies, as you'll see in chapters 6 and 7, that rely on descriptive methods, things like case studies, naturalistic and systematic observation, archival research, surveys. These are all descriptive in nature. A second goal is to predict behavior, right? So when we want to predict behavior, then we have to rely on correlational research. So correlations allow us to both describe, but the new thing they allow us to do is predict. And we're going to learn about correlations in chapter 12 or lecture 12. A third goal of science is to determine cause and effect. Now, one of the things that we will say in lecture 12 and many other lessons is that the experiment allows you to determine cause and effect, but correlation does not prove causation. So correlation allows you to say there's a link or association between factors, allows you to predict an outcome, but it doesn't allow you to determine cause and effect. So if you want to determine cause and effect, you need to do an experiment. And there are 3 prerequisites to determine a cause. Cook and Campbell in 1979 came out and they were offering criticism to some of the research of the day because they were overstating their findings. If you want to have cause and effect, you need 3 things. Temporal precedence. The cause must always precede the effect. If the cause doesn't precede the effect, maybe it was something else. Covariation of the cause. In the presence of the cause, you get the effect. In the absence of the cause, you don't get the effect. So only in the presence of a cause do you get the effect. That's covariation of the cause. The third thing is you need to eliminate alternative explanations. What do I mean by that? You need to eliminate all other factors that could have driven this outcome. And we're going to talk about the concept of confounding variables or extraneous variables. As much as you could get rid of confounding variables or extraneous variables, the more you can say A cause B. So get rid of all the alternative explanations. Last but not least, we want to explain behavior, right? And an experiment allows you to both determine cause and effect and explain behavior. So in lectures 8 through 11, we're going to be talking about experimental designs. The last piece of this lesson is on basic versus applied research. When we talk about basic research, we're focused on fundamental questions, about nature. So basic research might be, if you were in biology, what are the elements of the eye? What are the components of the eye? Right now, that could be useful, right? So being able to label the different parts of the eye. So it's almost like the foundational blocks or fundamental questions, right? So it's oftentimes linked to theoretical issues, whereas applied research is about solving practical problems. So applied research, let's take the eye example. Now, the question is, how do we treat glaucoma? Well, glaucoma is an eye-related disease. Now we're trying to solve that problem. So that's applied research. So oftentimes applied research is about solving practical problems. My question for you to think about is, which one is more important? Basic research or applied research? And my gut, pardon me, I shouldn't say my gut because we talked about intuition. My experience in 15 years of teaching is that most people jump to applied research because it solves the problem. But here's the deal. It's a trap question. Basic research and applied research are equally important. Because remember when we asked the question, how do you treat glaucoma? Well, what is glaucoma? How does it affect the structure of the eye and the components of the eye? You need to know what's being affected in order to treat it. So it's the basic research that drives that applied research. And when we see gaps in our applied research, we're going to need to do more basic research. So, moral of the story is neither basic nor applied research is superior to the other. Oftentimes, applied research is guided by basic research, and oftentimes, applied research drives more basic research. And it just goes in a circle. Remember, science, there are a lot of circles. It's a self-refining system. Basic leads to applied. Applied leads to basic. Basic leads to applied again. Applied leads to basic again. And it goes round and round. So they're equally important. And that, my friends, is our lecture. So I'm going to continue with lecture 2 next week, but hopefully this is an additional support as you're reading the chapter and as you're going through. So let's stop there.